Christians and Muslims sometimes have the dumbest debates and disagreements. So, let's talk about that. Welcome to Christian Dawah, brothers and sisters. My goodness, sometimes in watching interfaith dialogues or apologists talk about another religion, I'm just mind blown at some of the terrible arguments made by people on both sides. The problem with these bad arguments is that they can get the conversation off topic, and they can also lead to a lot of frustration and misunderstanding. So, to help us all not fall into the trap of making bad arguments, I've made a list of the 4 types of bad arguments that both Christians and Muslims tend to make. Now, for the record, by bad arguments, I don't necessarily mean false arguments. See, people of good faith in a debate can make intelligent arguments that are still false. That's the point of the discussion. What I mean by bad arguments are arguments that undermine the arguer's own position, or they're arguments that are based on extreme ignorance, or they're just arguments that are so off topic that even if they were true, they wouldn't really disprove the other person's point. So, let's get started. Now, I'm not saying that Christians and Muslims shouldn't use arguments from scholars who are atheists. That would be the genetic fallacy. An argument is good or bad based on its own merits, not depending on the beliefs of the person who offers it. That's not what I'm referring to here. In this case, we're talking about someone just throwing the names out of scholars who disagree with the other position. The problem with this is that almost all of the time, that scholar has an equally negative view of both Christianity and Islam. So, for example, Muslims often cite Bart Ehrman as a famous biblical scholar who argues against many core Christian doctrines, like the resurrection of Jesus, for example. Now, I don't have a problem with someone using Bart Ehrman's arguments. What I have a problem with is just throwing Bart Ehrman's name out there as an expert who backs up the Islamic position. If a Muslim looks into Bart Ehrman's actual arguments against the resurrection, he's going to discover that Ehrman's main argument is essentially a fallacious modern version of David Hume's argument against the possibility of miracles. In other words, Ehrman rules out the resurrection from the very beginning, but that's based mostly on his atheistic worldview. So the same argument that he uses against the resurrection of Jesus could also be used against the revelation of the Quran. So it's not an argument that Christians or Muslims should really be using because it's an argument against both of them. This one is an absolute cancer that has infected almost every corner of the Christian-Muslim dialogue. Because most biblical scholars don't know Arabic, and most Quranic scholars don't know Greek and Hebrew, it seems like there is an incredible amount of misunderstanding and false proof texting that goes on between the two of them. Christians almost always will cite passages from Surah Al-Baqarah, for example, where the Quran has commands to kill the unbelievers wherever they find them. And they use that as evidence of the evilness and violence inherent to the Quran and to Islam. Also, Christians sometimes cite Surah Al-Ahzab, ayah 56, as evidence that God prays to Muhammad. Now, the first example of God commanding Muslims to kill the unbelievers just demonstrates the Christians' lack of understanding of the context of Surah Al-Baqarah. It's not a universal decree. It's orders given to a specific people at a specific time for a specific battle. It's not a call to universal violence. Now, the second issue of God praying to Muhammad is a simple misunderstanding of the Arabic word salah. That word has a larger semantic range than the word pray does in English. So it can also mean to bless or to greet, depending on the preposition that you use with it. So for example, yusalli ala is very different than yusalli lahu. So clearly in this verse, Allah is blessing or greeting the Prophet. He's not praying to him. Muslims unfortunately do this all the time with the Bible, especially apologists like Ahmed Deedat and Zakir Naik. There are many areas they do this in, but for now, I'll just mention 2 examples about Jesus. Many Muslims claim that Jesus never claims to be God in the Gospels. They'll cite verses like John 5:19, where Jesus says that he can't do anything of his own initiative, but he can only do what the Father does. These Muslim apologists will also argue that Jesus predicts Muhammad's coming in John 14:16. Now, I'll be doing a full video on predictions of Muhammad in the Bible, but for now, I'll just say that this interpretation of the verse is totally out of line, because this verse is talking about the Holy Spirit. It's not talking about a future prophet. Now, the first example, where Muslims argue that Jesus never claims to be God, simply demonstrates a failure to read the entire book. Because in John 10:30, Jesus says, "I and the Father are one." So, both Muslims and Christians need to make sure that we are taking the time to study the original languages of the other religion and to read them in the proper cultural, historical, and literary context. Now, this is a terrible argument that is brought up not only by Christians and Muslims, but also by atheists. In these types of arguments, people make assumptions about how God should behave or what God should do, and then they say that certain beliefs in a religion contradict this imaginary God of theirs. For example, people do this all the time against Islam. They'll claim the God of the Quran commits violence. My question is, how does that disprove Islam? According to whose standard should God never call for a holy war? God has the right to do whatever he wants, and just because your intuition says that God wouldn't do that, that means absolutely nothing. A similar thing gets done when people argue against Christianity. Muslims sometimes argue that God would never ever come down to earth as a man who had to eat and sleep and use the toilet. And all those things are way beneath God's dignity. So my question is, how do you know that? If God is all-powerful, can't he do anything he wants? If God is God, then he's probably not really the insecure type. He's not trying to impress everyone. He is who he is. So why shouldn't God come down to earth to eat and sleep and use the toilet? Are you daring to tell God what he can't do? So, we can see that both these arguments are just based on personal intuitions about God, what God would or wouldn't do. And these are terrible arguments because they're actually just an argument based on your own personal psychology. It's something along the lines of, I don't like X, therefore the Islamic concept of God is wrong. We can see how dumb that is. So please, brothers and sisters, let's make sure we don't do this ever. Now, these may be the most insidious and worst arguments of all of them. They typically say something to the effect of, this element of Christian or Islamic culture is broken, therefore Christianity or Islam is false. Christians often point to the abuse of women, problems with terrorism, the oppression of minorities, and stuff like that in Muslim nations as negative aspects of Islamic cultures. On the other hand, Muslims will point to rampant sexual immorality, lack of family values, and lack of respect for tradition as negative things in Christian cultures. Both Christians and Muslims agree that humans are sinful and don't perfectly follow God, even when they're trying their best. So, it should be no surprise to all of us that there are lots of problems in both Christian and Muslim societies. So this is a dumb argument, because all societies have problems. If a culture problem proves your religion is false, then all religions are false, because all cultures have problems. So, like the first bad argument, which would be appealing to the authority of atheist scholars, anyone who makes this argument is basically just sawing off the branch that they're sitting on. If the argument is true, then you've destroyed your own position, which is pretty dumb. So, how do we avoid falling into one of these terrible arguments? Well, first, we need to make sure that we're engaging with these arguments in good faith, that we're really trying to understand the other side to the best of our abilities, and that we're giving them the benefit of the doubt at all times. Second, we need to study the language and the culture and the traditions of the other religion as best as we can. This is going to help us to understand their holy texts more fully and not make dumb mistakes. Third, we need to make sure that we are always making arguments and not just attacking. As long as we're making arguments with explicit premises and conclusions, we'll be less likely to just make claims based on our intuition or emotion. Finally, we need to approach the conversation with humility and love. None of us is perfect, especially when talking about someone else's religion. There's a high chance that we're going to get some things wrong, and we need to be okay with that and humbly accept the correction when it's brought. On the flip side, when someone makes a mistake about our religion, we should assume that they're making an honest mistake and lovingly bring correction, without ridicule or mockery. If we do all these things, then we can maybe have a productive, charitable discussion about some of the most important topics, and then we can all hopefully come to a better understanding of God's truth. So, thanks for joining me again today and accepting my invitation to dive deeper together. Peace and blessings be upon you and your family.